Hi everyone, I'm Rena 9, and we are getting our first look at the exit polling results coming in from the Alabama Senate race. For a closer look at the numbers, let's bring in CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. Okay, Anthony, we're looking at the breakdown here. Can we start first with the exit polling here that looks at the allegations against Moore and how folks factored this into their decision?
Right, that's obviously been probably the central thing in this race, right? So now for exit polls, what we're doing is we're sending interviewers all over the state and we're talking to real voters as they have left the polling places, and that's how we get these numbers. So what we've seen so far, and the polls are still open, so people are still voting, we should emphasize that. We've seen so far is that for Roy Moore's supporters, they're more inclined to say that those allegations were not a factor in their vote. But maybe not surprisingly, for Doug Jones's supporters, they're saying that those allegations were a factor in their vote. So not only a split in vote, of course, but a split in what they thought was important.
You look at that 89% of Jones, not so surprising there that you would see those numbers. But when you look at the allegations against Moore and you break it down here, Jones and Moore, you see just the divide, huh? Yeah,
you see the divide, and what you see in this graphic you have up here is that it's not just whether the allegations were important or not, but whether people believed them. And we had seen some of this in the pre-election polling as well. So the Roy Moore backers not only necessarily, is saying they don't think it's critical, but also that they're not true, that they don't believe them. And whereas the Doug Jones voters, perhaps dovetailing with the fact that they think that they're important, also tend to believe the accusations.
And whether Donald Trump was a factor in this election, you look at the breakdown, 57% said they voted to support him, Moore supporters.
Right. See, those Moore supporters seem to be queuing on that presidential endorsement. Again, maybe not a surprise because, look, Alabama is such a Republican state. Yeah. And by all accounts, the president has a very high approval rating there. When we surveyed the state and others, he's over 50%. In Alabama, he's not over 50% approval nationally. So what he says is going to matter to Republicans, and we're seeing that play out again in these exit polls. They're casting their Senate vote to support the president, and he made that clear. He wants that vote in the Senate. But by contrast, it's interesting, a lot of Doug Jones supporters say that their vote is not about Donald Trump at all. I find that interesting because it's not diametrically opposed. Yeah. You might think if the Democrats were really going to gin up turnout, they might be saying, oh, okay, take this vote as a way of pushing back against an administration in Washington that you don't like because you're Democrats. But we're not seeing that for Doug Jones, and I'll watch to see how that affects turnout for the rest of the evening.
I want to ask you about turnout. Is there anything we can gauge as to how turnout has been so far?
Yeah, turnouts during the day is always sort of sketchy with the kind of read you get on it. We've seen some anecdotal evidence that it's strong, right? And the exit polls, as people go along, we definitely think that it's strong so far. But look, there's still 3 hours left, so anything can happen in that regard. I think that what you look for, though, when we get towards the end of the night after polls close, is whether there's turnout in those Democratic places. And the difference here is that unlike most states, where I could sit down with you and say, you know what, in a typical race that a Democrat wins, it looks like this, and a Republican wins, it looks like this. In Alabama, there aren't any Democratic winners these days.
25 years since one's been in place, right?
Exactly. So a lot of people are kind of looking at this as a complete mystery because what does it look like in which counties and where when a Democrat wins, if a Democrat wins, we're not really sure. Then there's this other wrinkle where Roy Moore, when he has run statewide, has tended to underperform what Republicans typically do. As strongly as Republicans run, they get in the mid-60s when they run, Roy Moore's kind of underperformed that.
Is there a way to gauge? Are they just turned off by the issue, by the candidate? Can we tell?
Some conservative voters have felt like his particular brand of conservatism isn't quite for them. And yet, we can probably look at some counties, and we'll talk about this later in the night when the results come in, some counties where you find a slightly more moderate brand of Republican, where if you see Roy Moore start to underperform there, then that's not a good sign for him. But if he's doing as well as a typical Republican, then we remind everybody, this is Alabama, this is a Republican state, and he's probably going to do well. So that's kind of the thing to look at.
And the sense of when people decided who they were going to vote for. When did you decide exactly? I want to pull up that screen. You see here in Alabama, 60% said they decided before November.
Yeah, look, part of this is always going to be partisanship. Right? Republicans and Republicans are going to, in all the pre-election polls, are largely making a choice between supporting Roy Moore or maybe even staying home. There hasn't been a large amount of crossover voting that we've seen heading up to this. We'll see what the exit polls say once the polls close. But what that means is folks who are Republicans have always known they're going to support the Republican, and folks who are Democrats are always going to support the Democrat. But still, that 40% is not insignificant. And I mean, if you think about 40% of the electorate switching, that could throw this thing either way.
Yeah.
That's a last minute shift. And when people talk about coming into this, how the pre-election polls were all over the place, I always emphasize, yeah, some part of it is turnout, but some part of it is reality. Voters just don't make up their minds in something like this, maybe until it comes down to the wire.
I've got to ask you about evangelicals. Is there a way to see how they factored into this race?
Yeah, we will look at that. Evangelicals, by and large, have been strong supporters of the president, strong supporters of Roy Moore. That's been throughout this race. That's been true nationally as far as the president goes as well. They're strong backers of the Republican Party. And I think, you would expect to see that backing tonight from white evangelicals throughout Alabama. The question is it enough, right? Is it enough? Can Roy Moore hold then the rest of the Republican base? And if he can, then that'll be a really good sign for him.
Anthony Salvanto will be checking with you throughout the evening.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rhea.